My son and his wife thought I was an embarrassing old-school mother holding back their tech startup brand. To get rid of me, they took me on a Betty family vacation to Italy and abandoned me in a tiny village with a canceled plane ticket. They called me dead weight on Instagram while they partied on a yacht in Monaco. But they forgot one tiny detail. I wasn't just their mother. I was also their silent 51% majority shareholder, and I was about to call an emergency board meeting from a payphone. You know, the thing about Silicon Valley is that it's a place built by engineers that has forgotten how to value them. I was reminded of this at a dinner party in my son Tom's glass and steel box of a house in Palo Alto. It was all very minimalist and cold, filled with people whose job titles were as abstract as their conversation. They were talking about Tom's company Innovate and its latest funding round. I listened politely, and then during a lull, I asked a simple question about the scalability of their core algorithm, pointing out a potential bottleneck I saw based on my own work from my days at Intel. Tom just laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. He put his arm around me and told the group that his mom was just the cutest with her old-school Intel brain trying to keep up. His wife Ashley chimed in saying it was sweet that I tried to take an interest. They dismissed me and my 4 decades of pioneering work in microprocessing as a quaint family anecdote. But I'm an engineer. I'm trained to see the flaws in a system. And as I looked at my son's eyes, I saw the terror behind his smile, the deep, gnawing insecurity of a man terrified someone might discover he wasn't a visionary, just the son of one. A week later, they announced a surprise, a luxury, family heritage vacation to Italy. They presented it as this grand, generous gift to me, a chance to reconnect with the small village my husband had come from. But their tone was all wrong. It was the voice you use on a difficult child or a confused pet. They spoke of managing my itinerary and making sure I was comfortable, and I realized this wasn't a shared experience. It was a problem they were solving, and I was the problem. I was the inconvenient old-school mother who didn't fit their sleek, disruptive brand. The first few days in that beautiful, sun-drenched Italian village were deceptively peaceful. The pace was slow, the food was real, and for a moment, I let myself believe this trip could be a bridge between our worlds. I was wrong. On the third morning, I woke up to a silent villa. They were gone. On the kitchen table was a note written on Ashley's ridiculously expensive stationery. It explained with sickeningly sweet condescension that they'd been invited to an exclusive last-minute tech retreat in Monaco. They knew I'd be more comfortable and less stressed staying behind in the quiet village. Tucked inside the note were a few €100 in insult and a printout of my return flight itinerary. When I checked the confirmation number later, I found the ticket had been canceled. I didn't panic. Panic is an inefficient use of energy. I felt a deep, profound, and chillingly calm sense of disappointment. I had funded my son's entire company from the shadows, giving him the freedom to succeed or fail on his own. I had built the very foundation he stood on, and he and his wife had decided I was a crack in that foundation that needed to be plastered over. I walked to the small village cafe, ordered a cappuccino, and opened my tablet. I didn't have to look far. Ashley's Instagram was the first thing that popped up. There was a new post geotagged in Monaco. It was a photo of her and Tom on a magnificent yacht, their champagne glasses raised against a backdrop of the sparkling sea. They looked triumphant, liberated. And then I read the caption, the final undeniable confirmation of their cruelty. It said, "Leveling up, cutting out the anchors, and no dead weight." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The anchor I thought was about to show them just how deep the water really was. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I finished my cappuccino, the bitter coffee, a grounding force against the bitterness of the betrayal. The engineer in my soul took over completely. The hurt was still there, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface, but my mind was clear, moving with the cool, clean logic of a schematic. I wasn't a stranded mother. I was an analyst who had just identified a critical system failure. My son and his wife were that failure, and it was my responsibility to correct it. My first move wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet diagnostic test. I walked through the cobblestone streets of the village until I found what I was looking for, an old orange payphone booth. The weight of the heavy plastic receiver in my hand felt solid real. I fed my coins into the slot and dialed a number in San Francisco I knew by heart. It belonged to Kenji Tanaka, a powerhouse venture capitalist who sat on my son's board. More importantly, Kenji and I had started in the trenches at Intel together in the 80s. He answered, and I could tell he was surprised to hear from me. I kept my voice calm and friendly. I told him I was calling on a personal matter as an old friend. I asked him for a simple favor to use his board access to pull the original unredacted incorporation documents for Innovate. I asked him to look for an anonymous LLC called L. Wang Investments, and to see what he could find out. I didn't say it was me. I just planted a seed of curiosity and hung up. I didn't need to be in Monaco to see the result. I could picture it perfectly. Kenji, a man who misses nothing, would make a quiet inquiry. That inquiry would rocket through the corporate structure and land like a missile in the middle of Tom and Ashley's yacht party. I could see the frantic, whispered phone call from their lawyers, the forced smiles as they excused themselves. I could imagine them scrambling to invent a plausible lie, telling Kenji it was just some dormant legacy fund, a clerical error. But I knew Kenji. He would have heard the panic in their voices, and his finely tuned instincts would have told him that something was very, very wrong. The diagnostic was a success. The system was unstable. Now it was time to apply pressure. My next call was to my wealth management lawyer, Diane. Diane is not a woman you underestimate. She's sharp, formidable, and has managed my hidden fortune for over 20 years. There was no emotion in my voice, only instruction. I told her the time had come. I authorized her to prepare the legal documentation to formally unmask L. Wang Investments and reveal my identity as the 51% majority shareholder. I then instructed her to find the legal pretext we needed to call an emergency board meeting. As I was talking to her, I could almost hear the gears of my old life whirring back to life, a powerful engine warming up after years of sitting idle. The predictable countermove came 2 days later. My cousin forwarded me an email that Tom and Ashley had sent to the entire extended family. It was a masterpiece of manipulative concern. They wrote about their deep worry over my sudden and erratic decision to stay in Italy all alone. They mentioned my confusion and fragile state, painting a picture of a senile old woman who needed to be protected from herself. They were trying to build a narrative to poison the well and discredit me before I could make a move. They thought they were controlling the story, but all they did was hand me the justification for what I was about to do. They had no idea I wasn't just the anchor they had cut loose. I was the entire ocean, and the tide was about to turn. My email inbox was flooded with a syrupy wave of concern from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Tom and Ashley's little poison pen letter was working exactly as they'd intended. I received messages full of gentle advice about the dangers of traveling alone at my age and soft inquiries about my state of mind. I played my part perfectly. My replies were short, simple, and filled with just enough typos to be believable. I wrote about rediscovering my late husband's roots and enjoying the quiet village life away from the stresses of the modern world. I let them believe I was a fragile, disconnected old woman. In Monaco, I knew Tom and Ashley would be reading these forwarded emails with smug satisfaction, convinced their narrative was winning and that I was completely isolated and powerless. They couldn't have been more wrong. Their betrayal sent my mind hurtling back years to the day Innovate was born. I remembered sitting in a sterile downtown San Francisco law office with a much younger Tom who was vibrating with nervous energy. He had a brilliant idea, but no capital. I, on the other hand, had a fortune built quietly over decades from the Intel stock options I'd earned as a pioneering engineer. I could have just written him a check, but that would have been a gift, not an investment in his potential. I wanted him to build something himself, to feel the weight of his own success. So I created L. Wang Investments, an anonymous LLC. Through it, I provided every dollar of his seed funding, but I structured the deal to retain a 51% majority stake. It was my secret safety net, a kill switch. I prayed I would never have to use. I wanted my son to be a king, but I quietly remained the power behind the throne. My days in Italy took on a dual reality. To the outside world, I was a tourist. I visited the old church, sketched the rolling hills in a notebook, and learned the names of the local shopkeepers. But in the privacy of my small rental, I was a general orchestrating a war. My secure line to Diane was my command center. We weren't just planning a legal challenge, we were building an army. I started making calls to my true network, the old guard of Silicon Valley. These were colleagues from my Intel days and friends from my UC Berkeley engineering classes, people who were now titans of industry and respected board members across the valley. I told them the story, and their response was swift and unwavering. They were appalled by the disrespect and arrogance of the new generation. One by one, they pledged their proxy votes to me. They were loyal to the person who had built the road, not the flashy sports car now speeding down it. The final piece I needed fell into my lap, thanks to the one thing my son and his wife valued above all else, their own arrogance. Kenji sent me a link to a tech blog with a single word: hubris. The article was a fawning piece about how Tom and Ashley were redefining corporate synergy by leasing a private jet to fly a flock of social media influencers to Monaco for a lavish week-long party. There were photos of them all sipping champagne, hashtagging their own company, a grotesque display of fiscal irresponsibility. They were so drunk on their own success, so sure I was a non-entity, that they had grown careless. I looked at the article at the millions of dollars of shareholder money being burned for an Instagram post and felt a grim satisfaction. They had just handed Diane the legal justification she needed on a silver platter. I made one last call. I told her they had committed gross fiscal mismanagement and it was time to call the emergency board meeting. The call with Diane was brief and precise. I stood in my small Italian kitchen, the afternoon sun warming the terracotta tiles, and gave her the final authorization. The pieces were all in place. Tom and Ashley's grotesque party jet was the perfect legal pretext, a clear and flagrant case of fiscal mismanagement. Diane confirmed she had the proxy votes from my network secured. The trap was set. It was time to spring it. I knew the exact moment it happened. It was 9:00 a.m. in California, the start of the business day. I imagined the email notification with its severe, legally binding subject line landing in the inboxes of the entire board of directors. I pictured Tom and Ashley in their ridiculously expensive hotel suite in Monaco, probably just ordering room service, seeing the same email pop up on their phones. I had a copy of the notice Diane had drafted. It was a beautiful piece of legal devastation. It formally summoned them to an emergency board meeting to be held by video conference the following day. It cited in cold, unambiguous terms the reason to address gross fiscal mismanagement and to respond to a formal leadership challenge from the newly identified majority shareholder. And then, attached as an exhibit, was the legal documentation, the unmasking of my LLC, and the single sentence that I knew would shatter their entire world. Wang Investments is the legal holding of Linda Wang. From the quiet tranquility of my Italian village, I could practically hear the shockwave tear through Silicon Valley. The explosion would have hit Monaco moments later. I pictured their phones beginning to vibrate, then ring, then scream with a tidal wave of incoming calls. Panicked investors, furious board members, and no doubt the first curious reporters from the tech blogs who had gotten the tip-off. Their carefully constructed world of smoke mirrors and brand synergy would be imploding in real time. I imagined Ashley staring at her phone, her face a mask of disbelief, while Tom, my son, would be frantically trying to get his lawyer on the phone, the color draining from his face as he realized the truth. The anchor they had cut loose was not just holding the company steady, she owned the entire ship. Their alliance, a fragile thing built on shared ambition and mutual vanity, would never survive a blast of this magnitude. I knew them. Their partnership was a stock that only went up. Faced with total, humiliating failure, they would immediately turn on each other. I could almost hear the vicious whispered argument erupting in that opulent hotel room. He would blame her for being so careless on social media, for her obsession with status that led to the party. She would spit back that he was weak, that he was the one who was too terrified of his own mother to ever secure his own power. Their unified front would fracture, leaving only two terrified, selfish people fighting over the ruins. As the sun began to set over the Tuscan hills, I walked back to my favorite cafe. The chaos was an ocean away. Here, there was only the smell of espresso and the sound of church bells. I opened my laptop and composed one final email. It was addressed to the entire board, including Tom and Ashley. The message was concise, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. I wrote that I looked forward to discussing the company's new, more responsible direction with them all tomorrow. I ended it with a single, chillingly simple instruction. I told them to please ensure they have a stable internet connection. I hit send, then sat back and took a slow sip of my espresso. I was in total control, and they were powerless, terrified, and a world away. I had Diane book me a ticket out of the small regional airport, but my final destination wasn't home. Not yet. The flight was to Rome, where I reserved a private suite in the International Airport's business lounge. The morning of the emergency board meeting, I sat in a comfortable leather chair, a quiet oasis of polished wood and soft lighting. My lawyer Diane sat opposite me, her laptop open. We were ready. One by one, video windows popped up on our screen as the board members from around the world logged in. Then two more windows appeared, Tom and Ashley. They were in their hotel suite in Monaco, and it was a scene of pure chaos. The backdrop was a gaudy mess of champagne buckets and designer shopping bags. My son looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and drawn. Ashley's makeup couldn't hide the panicked fury in her eyes. They looked like cornered animals. I, in contrast, looked exactly like what I was, a retired engineer about to chair a technical review. Kenji Tanaka, as the acting board lead, called the meeting to order. He stated the reason for the meeting and then formally yielded the floor to the majority shareholder. He yielded the floor to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't speak of betrayal or abandoned mothers. I spoke like an engineer delivering a post-mortem on a catastrophic system failure. With Diane handling the slides, I presented my case. I started with the financials, showing the board in stark, undeniable numbers: the cost of the private jet, the unbudgeted influencer party, and a dozen other frivolous expenses that pointed to a culture of fiscal rot. I showed them the company's own internal metrics, demonstrating how their obsession with vanity projects and brand building had come at the expense of actual innovation. User growth had stalled. Core technology updates were months behind schedule. Then I delivered the final quiet blow. I reminded the board that the company's entire valuation was based on a single patented algorithm, an algorithm I had personally designed and written in my home office 10 years ago as the foundational piece of my initial investment. I let that fact hang in the air for a moment. I, the old school cute mother, was the architect of the very thing they had been so carelessly mismanaging. The judgment came swiftly, and it didn't come from me. It came from their peers. Kenji, his face a mask of disappointment, formally tabled a motion of no confidence in Tom as CEO and Ashley as COO, citing their gross mismanagement and, more importantly, their deliberate deception to the board regarding the company's ownership. He called for a vote. I watched my son's face on the screen as one by one, the board members, my old colleagues, the true titans of the industry, whose respect he so desperately craved, voted to remove him. They were fired. Unceremoniously and unanimously executed in a virtual boardroom by the very people they had tried so hard to impress. The next motion was to install me as the new interim chairwoman of the board. It, too, passed unanimously. I accepted the position with a calm nod. I had work to do. My first act as chairwoman was to turn to the company's CFO, who was also on the call. I gave him a single direct order. I instructed him to immediately freeze and recall all corporate credit cards and expense accounts assigned to Tom and Ashley, effective immediately. On the screen, I saw my son's and his wife's faces contort in a final horrified understanding. They had abandoned me in a small Italian village with a few €100. I was leaving them stranded in a Monaco palace, stripped of the power and money that had been their entire world. The system failure had been corrected. The video call ended with a simple click, but the silence in that Rome airport lounge was deafening. Diane gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. The war was over. I had simply presented the data and the system corrected itself. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful triumph, just the quiet, profound satisfaction of a complex problem finally being solved. By the time my flight to San Francisco was boarding, the story was already breaking. The tech blogs, fueled by leaks from board members, were in a frenzy. The headlines were sensational: Innovate CEO ousted in hostile takeover by secret majority shareholder, his own mother. My son and his wife weren't just fired, they were instantly transformed into a Silicon Valley legend, a cautionary tale of hubris and what happens when you disrespect the very founders who built the world you inhabit. Their professional and social annihilation was absolute. Their personal lives crumbled just as quickly. Ashley, whose entire identity was tied to being the wife of a tech mogul, left Tom within a week of their humiliating return from Monaco. Stripped of his CEO title, his corporate expense accounts, and the worshipful gaze of his peers, my son had nothing left that she valued. He was no longer a brand she could attach herself to. I heard he spiraled for a while, lost and adrift in a world that no longer revered him. It was months before he called me. The conversation was strained, broken. He didn't ask for money or for his job back. He haltingly tried to apologize, finally beginning to understand that the value he had so carelessly thrown away, my love, my support, my respect, was the only thing he had ever truly owned. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first fragile step out of the ruins he had created for himself. I thrived in my reclaimed role. I had no desire to be a day-to-day CEO. That was Tom's dream, not mine. I remained chairwoman of the board and hired a brilliant, no-nonsense executive from my network to run the company. My mission was to perform a cultural reset. At my first all-hands meeting, I laid out the new vision. Innovate would no longer be a lifestyle brand that happened to have a tech product. It would be a world-class engineering company. We slashed the marketing budget for influencer parties and private jets and rerouted that capital directly into research and development. My most important initiative was creating the Wang Foundation for Engineering Excellence, an in-house mentorship program dedicated to funding and supporting the next generation of young female engineers. The money they had wasted to build their fragile egos would now be used to build real, lasting careers. Months later, I was walking through the company's main research lab. The energetic hum of servers and quiet, intense conversations had replaced the hollow buzz of marketing meetings. I wasn't there for an inspection. I was there to work. A brilliant young engineer I was mentoring was stuck on a particularly nasty problem with a neural network algorithm, and I had an idea. The final scene of my old life was me being dismissed as cute and old school. The first scene of my new one was me, marker in hand, standing before a whiteboard covered in complex equations, collaborating with a mind as sharp as my own once was. I was no longer an anchor, a mother, or a grandma. I was Linda Wang, founder and engineer, fully in my element. My legacy not just reclaimed, but finally, truly valued. They say living well is the best revenge, and for a woman like Linda, that was certainly true. Her real victory wasn't just in a corporate takeover, but in reclaiming her identity as a founder. True justice, she proved, is about showing that the very old school wisdom they dismissed was the foundation of the world they took for granted. Her strength was not just underestimated, it was the system they failed to understand until it was too late. But sometimes showing them exactly who they messed with is a very close second.